What if I was to tell you that you are not important, you are not unique, and you are not blessed? How would you react to such statements? You'd probably think that it is a negative perspective of yourself, right? But what if I was to tell you that from the perspective of one of the deepest philosophies in the world, these sort of statements are actually a positive affirmation of life? Now, what philosophy am I speaking about? I am speaking about Taoism and the concept of straw dogs. Now, before we get in depth into straw dogs, from the perspective of Taoism, Taoism itself looks at life from an impartial manner, right? The heightened teachings of Taoism is to look at life impartially rather than the view of having partiality, either right or wrong, good and bad, and so forth and so on. It is a natural methodology. So it looks at things from the perspective of nature rather than the view of the human intellect and conditioning and socialization and so forth and so on. So when Taoism looks at everything, even our own lives, it doesn't look at it from a partial perspective, rather from the perspective of nature. And nature itself is impartial. And the Taoist sage actually emulates nature. So when we think of the ancient sages of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, they emulate nature itself and the way nature behaves rather than the socialization process that inculcates all of this conditioning within our mind, and then we think we are this or that, right? Nature doesn't think it is this or that because nature is completely impartial and does not have a bias over one thing over the other. That is for the human mind and intellect, right? And so when we look at Taoism as it reflects what nature is, then when we look at if something is important, unique, or blessed, how could anything be important, unique, or blessed from an impartial perspective, right? Because you are implying that, for example, you may be more blessed over others, right? Which makes completely no sense. And we know that certain religions believe that if you embody a certain doctrination, then you are more blessed than others, right? But you are not looking at it from the natural perspective that Taoism looks at it from. Nature is impartial, and the Tao, as a result, is impartial. That irreducible essence of the universe, that ultimate substratum, that which is beyond everything, is completely impartial. And that is what is immanent within reality and at the same time transcends it, right? And so how should we then look at our lives as a reflection of nature? So first of all, when we look at nature, right, nature is somewhat like a machine. Now, think about it like this, right? So nature is completely unaware of the effects of its actions. So, for example, it doesn't care that tornadoes destroy houses, that earthquakes and tsunamis destroy entire communities, nor does it care that winter destroyed all the crops that were grown in the summer and spring. So that's how nature is like a machine, right? It does not care. It just is what it is. And so nature doesn't have a bias towards one people over the other. It just acts as nature acts. And we feel the effects of that. And so for myself personally, I've been in a bunch of earthquakes, and it's not a nice thing to be in, and a lot of people lose their lives, and it's a very terrible situation. But when we look at it from this perspective, nature doesn't have a bias for one people over the other. It's just the way of nature. This is how nature functions, and we are just in its world. We are not transcending it. We are a part of it, and so we have to navigate its effects rather than it abiding by how we feel, right? And so why I'm saying all this is because there's a deeper teaching in this, and this is what the Taoists are looking at. And so when we look at this in relation to the Taoist sage, right, the Taoist sage also has the same indifferent outlook as nature. The Taoist sage, like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, doesn't have a bias over one person over the other, one ideology over the other. It sees everything impartially. They have actually completely fasted their mind, and so they see everything equally. And so just as nature is indifferent to our own view of how life should be, the sage is completely indifferent to the dramas of the world, right? The sage just goes about their business and doesn't believe in right or wrong, good and bad. They don't have a side to defend. And so they take no sides because they see life equally. They essentially do not add any more fuel to an already raging fire. And so This is what I need you to understand first, right? So we have the way of nature. So the way of nature is, in a sense, like a machine. It's obviously not a machine, but it's like a machine in the sense that it is indifferent to our own emotions and our own sensibilities about life, right? We may sit around and go, why God, why? Like if some natural disaster happens to us, but we're kind of not looking at it in the right way. This is what Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi are saying, right? And so the sage then begins to emulate the way of nature. It doesn't mean that they are completely heartless to people, but it means they're indifferent to the concerns of the world. They're indifferent to what people believe is right or wrong. They've kind of risen above that, and they can see reality from above. Now, this is what leads me into the philosophy of the straw dogs. Now, it's a core concept within Taoism that's very important for us to understand in relation to how nature functions like this, with complete indifference to our own personal and human sensibilities. Now, I want to read to you a brief verse from the Tao Te Ching, which explains straw dogs like no other. Heaven and earth are impartial and regard myriad things as straw dogs. The sages are impartial and regard people as straw dogs. So the idea of straw dogs comes from rituals within ancient China. So there would be these straw dogs, made of straw actually, in the rituals, and at the end of the ritual they would discard the straw dogs like they were nothing. They may throw them into fire, throw them into rubbish, with complete indifference to what the straw dog represent, right? So they discarded with complete indifference. Now, this is significant for eliminating our unintelligent anthropocentric view of specialness, right? So this is the end of specialness. So this idea of feeling you are important, unique, or blessed over others. And this was a very important practice within Taoism, because getting over specialness is very important, obviously, because from a holistic perspective, we are no greater than an ant, right? We all play our part in the natural world, but we feel, as humans, we feel like we are better than other species. We feel like even sometimes we're better than this own planet, and so forth and so on. And so we have this sense of specialness, right? But we don't understand that nature is completely impartial. And humans have this idiotic perspective of morality where we think with a moral lens. But when we look out into nature, what is the morality between the lion and the gazelle, right? For the lion, their morality and their way of life is to be in an area where there are a lot of gazelles so they can feast upon them. And for a gazelle, it's to be in an environment where there are no lions so they can graze peacefully, right? But that is not how nature is. Nature is just to and fro, and it's completely impartial. And so we are not above that, and we are not separate from that, but we have this idiotic view of morality that we believe we are above it and we don't abide by the natural constitution of the planet, but that is not true at all. And so as a result, we are all straw dogs. We are the straw dogs of heaven and earth, right? And so, like I said, with nature being somewhat like a machine, it doesn't care that tsunamis and earthquakes destroy entire communities. Nature discards with us like straw dogs as well. It doesn't mean it doesn't love us, but it just means that this is actually just the way that nature functions. It functions like that, and it doesn't have a view of a good person over a bad person, right? This kind of resolves the age-old argument of why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, right? Again, how are we looking at that? We're looking at that from a human moralistic lens. Nature, the Tao, does not care about human morality. Humans are just a part of the universe. They are not at the top of the tree. We are just a part of the universe. And we don't realize that, right? Because we feel like we're at the top of the tree and we are the stewards of the planet and the universe and so forth and so on. But we don't realize that we are just straw dogs, and nature will discard of you and I when it sees fit, and we have no say about that. And that is a sobering truth for each and every one of us. And so nature discards of us with no attachment, as I said. So, for example, you might be special to your family and friends, but no one else really cares about you in reality, right? Because they don't really know you. And so, for example, if you were discarded as a straw dog on one side of the planet, on the other side of the planet, they're happily going about their day without any awareness that nature has discarded of one of its straw dogs, right? So like I said, this is a sobering truth because you are important to your family and friends. But outside of that circle, I mean, we aren't like that important or not as important as what we believe, right? So whoever you are, alive or dead, has no bearing on someone else on the other side of the planet. And this again allows us to build distance from this anthropocentric view that we believe we are the center of the universe, and we are definitely not. So billions of souls have actually lived on this planet, right? But nobody can remember their name. Think about that, right? We will all be added to that list where nobody will remember our name. And is this a negative thing, right? And I'm telling you today that this is more of a positive affirmation and something that is of the high nature within Taoism. Okay, it is definitely a sober truth for your sense of specialness, but this sobering truth can humble even the most egotistical of heart, right? This is about humility and about understanding the way of the Tao, understanding the way of nature and aligning with that. So this is not a negative view. Rather, it is positive because when we remove our self-centered view of ourselves, we begin to open ourselves to the Tao, right? This is the whole point of this philosophy. Once we eliminate that self-obsession we have and the self-centeredness, not just of ourselves, but of us as a species, it opens us to the way of nature and the way of the Tao. This is why the sages emulate the Tao, because that's actually the way it is. But we grow up in a culture where, yes, you can do anything and this and that. And I'm here to tell you, no, you can't. So you have to abide by the way of nature and get out of this type of specialness, because this idea of yes you can and you can climb the tree and be at the top of the heap and so forth and so on is all ridiculous. This is all of the doctrine of an achievement-based society. But we need to grow distance from that because that's illusory, and all that does is only inculcate depression and anxiety and stress. On the other hand, knowing the way of nature frees your heart from this self-obsession and allows you to align with the way things actually are. And so the world doesn't love you when you are alive and hate you when you're dead, as most people think. Rather, nature is empty of those emotions. It's non-emotional, right? And so objectively, life and death occur with complete impartiality. That's something we need to think about. It happens with a complete impartiality because we are straw dogs. So we have to get out of this hypnosis that there's this all-governing God determining when we are born and when we die from the Taoist perspective, right? Because the fact of the matter is, nature discards of its straw dogs without losing any sleep. And so there is no God determining whether you will be alive or dead, right? Nature discards of us as straw dogs, doesn't lose any sleep, and it moves on. Now this reminds me of a brief verse from the Tao Te Ching. The Tao loves and nourishes all, but does not lord it over them. So you see in that quote, the Tao loves and nourishes all, but does not lord it over them. This is the way of nature, right? This is the way of straw dogs. So the deeper lesson in regards to straw dogs is that they are not made for emotions, but instead because they serve a particular function or purpose. That is what the straw dogs are. And that's how we need to think of our lives, right? A sage understands they serve a particular function and purpose for the Tao, right? They have removed themselves out of the way so the Tao can express itself through them efficaciously without having this strong identity in the way that believes it's the center of the universe, right? It still doesn't realize it's a straw dog. So the deeper lesson here is nature discards of us without emotions. So the straw dogs of humans are not here to be confused and lost in their emotions, but rather we are here to serve a particular function and purpose of the Tao. We need to become an aperture of the Tao, right? And this is why when people are on the spiritual path, for example, that if they're overly emotional, they don't go too far on the spiritual path, because the emotions are arising from the idea of being important, being unique, being blessed, right? This heightened sense of individuality and identity. And in Taoism, we have to rise above that, because in understanding that we are straw dogs, we understand that the identity itself is very temporary and illusory, and actually is most of the time self-obsessed, right? And so that eclipses the view of the impartial reality from your consciousness, because you operate from partiality. How can you understand the Tao, the way of nature, through partiality? You yourself need to be impartial, right? Partiality arises from emotions, arises from agendas and biases you have. Whereas if you're impartial, you see nature as the way it is, rather than the way you think it ought to be. So your particular function and purpose in this life is not about your emotions and your identity and how high you can climb the chain of success. Rather, it is about aligning with the fundamental forces of the river of Tao, right? I often use the river of Tao analogy, where when we look at the river, if you're fighting the current, or if you're holding on to the banks of the river, you will not know the Tao. You will drown, or you will get exhausted on the bank of the river. You essentially need to let go. And once you let go, the river's power becomes your power. This is what in Chinese is called de, virtue, right? So that's the Tao driving your life now. You've given up all of this striving and trying to control reality, and you've given up this idea of holding on to this anthropocentric view of the world, which evokes a lot of emotions, because you're operating from a place of partiality, and instead you've let go and the Tao is guiding your life. And so you have the impartial eyes and you see reality as it truly is. And so the Tao's power becomes your power. And so emotions only get in the way of seeing nature as it truly is, right? Seeing it from an impartial perspective. Does that mean emotions are bad in and of themselves? No, they're not inherently bad. Emotions obviously can be beautiful, but they are often confused with the reality that we are experiencing, right? And so we confuse the reality we are experiencing with our own conditioned perspective, which then evokes a certain emotion to the experience we are having. So that can be an obstacle on the path for many. If it's a beautiful emotion shared with loved ones or this and that, this is beautiful. It brings a lot of flavor and joy to life, right? But most of the time, our emotions are evoked with things we disagree with and so forth and so on, because we're operating from a partial perspective. And this is what Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi are telling us to rise above, for us to be as nature is. The sages essentially rise above emotions because they have fastened their mind back into its original nature, right? And so Zhuangzi, like he said, once he fastened his mind, from the still point of the Tao, he could see the infinite in all things, right? And so he was operating from an impartial state of consciousness. He perfectly emulated nature as it is, right? He understood that he himself was a straw dog and nature will discard of him when it needs to be. And so the whole idea of straw dogs, to go back to what I've been speaking, is about having this impartial state of consciousness. It doesn't mean that you're a heartless person. It means you see reality from a higher perspective, but you're not confusing reality with your emotions, your personal agendas and biases and so forth and so on, right? You see the world impartially. The whole metaphor of the straw dogs is to emulate the sage's mind, to see the world in an impartial manner, not be caught in the dramas of the world, to see the infinite in all things, as Zhuangzi said. So you're not in this dichotomy of right and wrong, good and bad, so forth and so on. Because first of all, that's always operating from a personal subjective perspective that has been conditioned. It's gone through a socialization process. That is not as nature is, right? That's as human life is, and humans still are nature, but it comes from the human mind that has been confused with right and wrong, good and bad. It's still not seeing the world impartially, it's seeing the world partially. So the way of nature is to see the world impartially, and that's how we can understand that we are straw dogs, because straw dogs are cast away with no emotions because it has served its particular purpose and function, and it is no longer needed, right? From the ritualistic perspective, if we look at the actual rituals. And so each and every one of us serve a purpose and function for the Tao, right? But we often don't realize that because we're often caught in our own emotions, our own self-obsession, our own self-interest, because we see the world partially. Once we begin to eliminate that partiality, we begin to see the impartial Tao in everything, because the nature of reality is oneness, right? And this is Taoism's fundamental teaching, that oneness is the only reality. But that cannot be understood from a perspective of partiality, because you're still seeing right and wrong, good and bad, and so forth and so on. You need to have complete trust. And as I always say, trust is the paradox of unity or oneness, right? It is that paradox. If you don't have it, then you don't know it, right? Because you're still fighting the current of the river, or you're trying to hold on to the banks of the river. You haven't let go and allowed the Tao's power to become your power. And this is where the straw dog concept comes in, because the letting go of the banks of the river and then stop fighting the current of the river, you understand that you are a straw dog and you are here to serve the Tao's fundamental purpose for your life, and not your own individual conditioned view of your life, right? It's the Tao's life, it's not your life. It's the Tao doing you and not you doing the Tao. Now that is the fundamental understanding we need to come to when we understand truthfully this concept and philosophy of the straw dogs that we find within Taoism. Shanti, shanti, shanti.